On that fateful night, the one who walked into my fiancé's room wasn't me. It was a stranger, an Omega with a face that mirrored mine like 2 drops of water. I was the one who had hired him to come, because the doctor said that if I ever completed this marriage, it would kill me. I thought I had calculated everything perfectly, until my fiancé began falling for the wrong person. And even more unexpected, from that night on, all 3 of us were swept into a secret none of us could turn back from, because the one whose face mirrored mine like 2 drops of water was my own brother. My engagement to Leng Yi was held on an autumn evening in the grandest villa in the French concession, rented solely by Leng Trading House for the occasion. Chandeliers lit the entire hall, red wine filled every glass, and the soft sound of a piano drifted from a corner of the room. Everything so perfect I could barely breathe. I stood beside Yi for hours, hand in hand, smiling at the right moments, bowing at the right times. So did he. We were the couple all of Shanghai marveled at. The eldest son of Leng Trading House and the young master of the Y family, paired like 2 faces of a finely polished gold coin. Except no matter how polished a coin is, what's inside is still just cold metal. The bond between us had formed 2 years earlier on an ordinary afternoon, arranged by both families, in a room neither of us truly wanted to be in. It had never once been warm, I knew it. Ye surely knew it too. We simply never said it aloud, because some things people choose not to name, just so they can keep living alongside them. I went for a follow-up exam a week after the engagement, alone, without telling Yi. The Western Clinic sat on a small street near the French concession, a place I'd been visiting for over 2 years, long enough that the elderly French doctor no longer asked if I'd brought family along. He looked at the results, then at me, with an expression I'd long since memorized, the look of someone preparing to say something no one wants to hear. He said my body was depending on the suppressants at an alarming level. That if I stopped the dose abruptly, my heat would hit far more violently than any ordinary Omegas, that I should consider speaking with my partner. I told him there was no need, thanked him, said I could manage on my own. On the carriage ride home, I looked out the window, watched Shanghai's streets cast their shadows under the yellow lamplight, and calculated, not how to cut back on the medication, but how to make sure Yi never found out how much I was taking, or why I had to take so much. He told me about what happened at the hospital that day the way one might mention a small piece of gossip over dinner. He said a nurse's aide had bumped into him in the hallway, an unfamiliar pheromone, nothing worth noting. He kept eating after he said it, not even looking up. I set down my chopsticks, asked him to describe the person. He described them, about this tall, hair like this, wearing a white nurse's uniform. I nodded, said it sounded like someone new, then picked my chopsticks back up. But something inside me had just tightened, not painful, just a pull, like someone had given a thread a light tug. I didn't know why. I'd never met that person before. There was no reason at all to dwell on some nameless nurse's aide my fiancé had accidentally brushed past in a hospital corridor. I let the feeling go, the way I always did with things instinct recognized before reason could catch up. He never asked why I always kept my distance. That was something I was both grateful for and afraid of in him. He observed a great deal, asked very little, but whatever he didn't ask, he found his own way to answer. I knew he noticed. Noticed how I avoided his touch, avoided the dim moments an engaged couple shouldn't have needed to avoid. I had my reasons tied to that exam result, to what the French doctor had told me about the bond and my body. But that reason could never be spoken. Because speaking it meant explaining further, and explaining further meant touching something I'd buried deep before this marriage was ever arranged. I just kept smiling, kept just enough distance that no one would suspect anything. I was good at control. It was the one thing I was truly good at. Something I'd spent over 20 years perfecting, so that nothing could touch me without my permission. I learned of Wai Ming's existence not through a detective, not through any investigation, but through a street vendor near the hospital, a woman who seemed to know nearly everyone who worked on that block. She looked at me, stopped, then asked, "Are you Ming's brother?" "Goodness, you two look exactly alike." I stood still, asked her to say more. She told me there was a boy named Wai Ming working as a nurse's aide at the hospital, no parents, raised in an orphanage on the outskirts, gentle, hardworking, taking on odd jobs to cover medicine for a close friend. Surname Wai, a face like mine, no family. I thanked her and walked on, my steps even, my composure intact, until I turned into the alley beside it. Then I stopped, leaned against the cold brick wall and closed my eyes. My heart was beating a little faster than usual. Just a little, but for me, that was already too much. I overheard that phone call one afternoon entirely by accident. He came home earlier than usual, and I couldn't hang up in time. I only managed to turn my back and lower my voice, but in the quiet of this villa, a lowered voice didn't mean unheard. I told the person on the other end. Stick to the plan. Everything needs to be ready that night. The substitute is arranged. Then I hung up, turned around, and saw you standing in the doorway. He looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then I smiled, asked him why he was home early, my voice as calm as if discussing the weather. He answered just as calmly, but I caught his eyes, the look of someone memorizing every word he'd just heard, rearranging the pieces, trying to fit them into a picture he hadn't yet seen clearly enough to understand. He didn't understand yet, but he was beginning to ask questions. And that was something I didn't have much time to deal with. I didn't meet Wai Ming for the first time anywhere grand or memorable. I met him at a market corner near the hospital on a drizzly morning while he was buying steamed buns for breakfast with a few coins counted carefully in his palm. I stopped. My heart skipped an odd beat. That face, those features, resembled mine so closely that if I hadn't been standing there looking out, but looking into a mirror instead, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. He glanced up, caught me staring, gave a polite little nod, then walked off into the rain, a bag of buns in hand, his thin frame wrapped in a worn cotton jacket. I stood watching him for a while, then I began looking into him, his name, his age, where he lived, his circumstances. And the more I learned, the heavier that tightness in my chest became, in a way I didn't want to name, because naming it meant facing it, and facing it meant doing something about it, and I wasn't ready for that, not yet. I went to find Wai Ming one evening, alone, unannounced. The room he rented sat down a narrow alley, the whitewashed walls stained yellow, the smell of damp and lamp oil mingling together. Ming opened the door, saw me, and I immediately saw him freeze. The same reaction I'd had at the market that day, the same pause, the same look in his eyes upon seeing a face too familiar to have never met before. I didn't explain the resemblance. I only said, "I need you to do something. Just one night, you won't need to know anything more." Ming looked at me for a long time, asked who I was. I said surname Wai, nothing more. He looked at me the way someone reads a page torn in half, knowing something was wrong, but without enough to know where. I set the envelope of money on the table. Then I waited. I'd calculated everything long before that. It was how I lived, how I existed in a world where I always felt I was standing on unsteady ground. His suppressants, I knew where he kept them, what dose he took when he restocked. I didn't need to do much, just make sure the bottle ran low at the right moment with no new one to replace it, that simple. I sat before the mirror that dark night, looked into my own eyes and asked myself when exactly I had become this cold. The answer was, a long time ago, from the day the doctor told me a full bond with an alpha would slowly kill me. From the day I understood this marriage was a beautiful trap I had no way out of except by finding another path. I didn't hate Yi. I didn't hate Ming. I was only trying to survive the only way I knew how, by controlling whatever could be controlled, before something else controlled me instead. I was sitting in my private room upstairs when I first heard Yi's phone ringing for me. I looked at the telephone on the desk, let it ring, then let it stop. The second time he called, I picked up the receiver, then set it back down without answering. By the third time, I didn't even glance over. I knew the symptoms had started. A heat triggered by depleted suppressants didn't arrive gradually. It came like a breached dam, and Yi was alone downstairs with that. I sat still, hands resting on my lap, watching the oil lamp in front of me. The flame was small, golden, unwavering. I told myself I'd planned this carefully, that everything was on track, that nothing needed to change. I told myself that, but my hands were clenched tighter and then tighter still, until my nails dug into my palms. I brought Ming into the innermost room of the villa just as dusk fell, while he was still out handling business at the trading house. The seldom used sitting room, red velvet curtains drawn shut, every lamp off, only the scent of old wood and the cold edge of an autumn night slipping through the gaps in the door. I told Ming, no lights, no names asked, leave once it's light out. Ming stood in the middle of the dark room, looking at me. In the faint glow from the hallway, I saw his shoulders tense, his breathing not quite even, his hand gripping lightly at the hem of his robe, trembling, but he didn't leave. I looked at that face, a face so strangely like mine, and in the darkness, even more so, then closed the door. I went up to my own room, sat down, placed my hands on my lap, and waited. I didn't turn on the light. Sitting in the dark was fine. I'd long grown used to it. So used to it that sometimes I wasn't sure anymore whether I still feared it or not. Yi's footsteps sounded past midnight, unsteady, heavier than usual, stumbling slightly on the last step of the hallway. I sat still in my room, listening. The footsteps stopped in front of that room. Ming's scent, even without him being in full heat, was enough to pull a losing control alpha toward it like an invisible thread. I had known this would happen. I had accounted for it. But when I heard that door open, then close, I still closed my eyes for a second, not regret, just something in my chest sinking in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. A faint bond formed that night in the dark room where neither of them saw the other's face. I couldn't feel it from where I sat, but I knew it had happened. Knew it the way someone who had calculated everything except this exact thing would know. The oil lamp on the table burned down to nothing while I sat still, watching it fade into the dark, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether I was still in control, or whether I was now being controlled by the very thing I'd built with my own hands. It wasn't fully light yet when I heard the sitting room door open softly, then light footsteps on the wooden floor, the front door creaking open, then silence. Ming was gone, just as instructed. I sat there until it was bright enough, then went downstairs. A while later, Yi's footsteps sounded from the inner room, slower than usual, like someone who had just woken up and was trying to piece together what remained in his head from the night before. Then he stopped. The silence stretched long enough for me to know he'd just realized something. Then he called my name, an ordinary tone, neither high nor low, but I knew that voice. The voice of someone holding a piece of a puzzle, needing a few more before asking outright. I took a breath, straightened my robe, and walked in. He stood in the middle of the sitting room, watching me walk in. He didn't speak right away, just looked at me, then glanced toward the room Ming had left not long before, then looked back at me. The early morning light slipped through the curtain gap, pale gold, enough for me to see his face clearly. That scent wasn't yours. Not a question, not an accusation, just a confirmation, calm to the point of coldness. I kept my expression unchanged, told him he probably hadn't fully woken from the night before, that heat could leave behind hallucinated scents, that he should sit and have some tea first. He looked at me 1 second. 2 seconds. Then, without another word, he turned and sat down. I exhaled inwardly, lightly, without letting it show, and told myself this was only the first step, that everything was still within reach. That morning at breakfast, he didn't ask right away. He sat eating, flipping through the newspaper, drinking tea so ordinary that if I hadn't known better, I would have believed last night had been just another ordinary night to him. Not until I was about to stand up did he finally speak, not looking up from the paper. Your scent was different last night. I paused, sat back down, and thought of the bottle of osmanthus oil on my dressing table. Told him I'd switched to a new fragrance recently, asked if it bothered him, said I'd change it back if so. He turned to a new page. No need. Those 2 words dropped onto the table, brief and cold, and I didn't know whether they meant he believed me, or that he was simply choosing not to ask further yet. I stood, gathered the teacups, and didn't let it show that my heart had just skipped a beat. I learned Yi had hired a detective one afternoon when I happened to see him talking with an unfamiliar man at a street corner near the trading house. The kind of man whose stance and watchful eyes gave his profession away at a glance. I stood some distance off, watched the two exchange a few words and part ways, and knew at once who he was searching for, not out of anger. He wasn't someone who acted out of anger. He acted because he needed to know, because something didn't add up in his mind and he couldn't let it rest until he found the missing piece. The faint bond beneath his skin was doing that, pulling him toward someone whose face he'd never seen, in a way reason couldn't explain and instinct refused to quiet. I watched his figure disappear into the crowded street, then turned and kept walking. I had known this day would come. I just hadn't known it would come this soon. I didn't know much about how Ming spent those days after that night, only fragments. Things the detective's reports accidentally revealed later, and things Ming told me himself once we'd grown close enough to speak honestly. He went back to the hospital, back to his side jobs, back to the small rented room with its yellowed walls. But his body wouldn't let everything return to how it had been. For the first time in his life, natural heat appeared in Ming years later than most Omegas, as if he'd suppressed it with medication for so long that his body could no longer hold it back. The doctor said the faint bond had triggered his cycle. I heard that later and sat still for a long time. I had accounted for many things that might happen. I hadn't accounted for this, that what I'd pulled Ming into that night wasn't just a transaction, but something that had changed his body in a way that couldn't be undone. The detective's report reached you one evening. I knew because the next morning he looked at me differently. Not by much, just one more layer behind his eyes, like someone looking at a familiar painting and suddenly noticing a detail they'd never caught before. I learned later that among the photographs the detective had taken, there was one of Ming standing outside the hospital gate under a street lamp. He looked at that photo and mistook it for me for 1 second, then he looked again, and realized it wasn't. The same face, but different eyes, one accustomed to silk and calculation, the other accustomed to rain and fending for himself. He ordered further investigation into why Ming's origins, and I suspect that from that moment on, everything began moving in a direction I no longer fully controlled. Yi ran into Ming again at the hospital one afternoon. He told me about it later, not because he wanted to, but because by then everything had already come undone and there was nothing left to hold back. He said Ming didn't recognize him. Ming walked past, gave a polite nod the way one greets a stranger, and kept walking. But Yi stopped. Because that scent, exactly that scent, the one that had lingered on the sheets the morning after that fateful night, the scent he'd spent months trying to place, was walking right past him in broad daylight, in ordinary light, with no darkness, no instinct, no heat involved. He said his heart skipped out of rhythm. He said it so plainly that I knew it was true, because he wasn't someone who used phrases like that unless he had no other way to describe it. I listened to him tell it and looked down at my hands. Everything I had calculated was beginning to drift in another direction. He approached Ming under the guise of hiring a personal assistant. I didn't know about it until it was already too late to intervene. By the time I found out, Ming had already accepted. I stood at my window, looking down at the villa courtyard, and for the first time felt something I didn't want to name, something caught between panic and something older, deeper, something I'd buried since that rainy morning at the market corner when I first saw Ming. I had accounted for Yi finding Ming. I hadn't accounted for him wanting to keep Ming close. That night I sat at my dressing table looking into the mirror, and for the first time in years I couldn't clearly tell what I was thinking, only that the board I had set up myself now had pieces moving in directions I had never placed. I learned Ming had started working for Yi on the morning he appeared in the main hall of the Leng trading house, a stack of files in hand, asking the gatekeeper about the entrance. I stood on the second floor, looking down over the railing. My heart skipped a strange beat. Not panic. Panic was something I knew how to handle, knew how to press down and conceal. This was something else, something beneath panic, older with no clear shape to grasp onto. I hadn't expected Yi to actually track down the person from that night. Not because I underestimated him, I had never underestimated Yi, but because I thought the faint bond would fade with time, that he'd remember that night as an anomaly and simply move on. I had been wrong. And that mistake was now standing in the main hall downstairs, bowing in thanks to the gatekeeper, then walking inside. I watched Ming during his early days working at the trading house. Never openly, just chance moments passing in the hallway, sitting in the tea room glancing through the glass. Ming worked carefully, spoke little, kept everyone at a polite enough distance. The same with Yi, not close, not distant, simply professional in the way of someone used to fending for himself since childhood, used to relying on no one. But I saw the times they stood near each other at the desk, looking over the same file together. Ming would pause mid-sentence. Yi would glance over, and both would simply continue as if nothing had happened. The faint bond was humming between them. I recognized it instantly because I knew what it looked like, that brief moment, that pause with no apparent reason. I knew, and there was nothing I could do but keep watching. Yi told me he'd asked Ming about his family, not directly, but through an offhand question over a work lunch that he mentioned to me afterward, almost in passing. Ming told him a little, not too much, left at an orphanage as an infant, never knowing his parents, raised fending for himself, nothing to remember but whitewashed walls and the smell of thin morning porridge, told calmly without needing anyone's pity. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked what Ming's surname was. Ming said why, given by the orphanage staff, no way of knowing if it was his real name. He said he understood and asked nothing more. But I knew, because I knew Yi, that he was memorizing every word, comparing, forming questions he hadn't yet voiced, about a coincidence he himself didn't yet have enough pieces to assemble. I went to find Ming one afternoon, alone, for the second time since that fateful night. This time I looked straight at his face in full light, not the dim shadows of his rented room's doorway like before. And I was shaken. Not because I hadn't known beforehand, I had already seen Ming at the market, already knew he resembled me. But looking straight into his face in broad daylight, every feature, every detail was something else entirely. Like looking into a mirror reflecting back 20-some years that weren't mine. I held myself together, pulled out the envelope of money, told Ming the position at the Leng trading house wasn't suited for him, that I could find him something better elsewhere, that he should leave. Ming looked at the envelope, then at me. He didn't take it, asked why. I couldn't answer that, not because there was no reason, but because the real reason was something I couldn't say aloud in broad daylight on this street. Ming gave a polite nod and walked away, leaving me standing alone with the envelope in hand, and for the first time in my life, no idea what to do next. He came home later than usual for dinner that night, his outer coat not yet changed, sitting down at the table and calling for the servant to bring more rice. I asked if something had come up. He said no, just a backlog of files keeping him until evening, and began eating. After a while of silence, he added, his tone as casual as discussing the weather. Ming misread a figure, nearly let the trading house buy out an entire block over one shipment of fabric. Then he gave a small laugh, light, brief, real. I looked down at the bowl in my hands. He didn't realize he'd just laughed in front of me because of someone else. Not the polite social laugh I'd grown used to over the past 2 years, but the kind of laugh from someone who just remembered something that genuinely amused them. He kept eating, kept talking about trading house matters. And I sat there, chopsticks in hand but never raised, realizing that for the first time in 2 years of living together, I had just heard Yi laugh for real, and the person who'd made him laugh wasn't me. He set the report on the table in front of me one evening, said nothing, just looked at me. I looked down at the paper. Why Ming's orphanage file, name, date of admission, origin. But in the notes at the bottom was a small line the detective had circled in red. The file had been altered the year the child turned 3 by someone who left no name. Someone had erased the trail. I read that line twice, then set the paper down and looked back at Yi. He asked if I knew anything about this. I said no. That answer wasn't entirely a lie. I didn't know who had altered the file, didn't know exactly what trail had been erased. I only knew Ming existed, knew he carried the surname Y, and knew there was a reason I didn't want to dig any deeper into it. He looked at me a moment longer, then gathered the report back up, asked nothing further. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to rain tap against the roof tiles, and for the first time felt truly afraid, not afraid of Yi discovering the truth, but afraid that the truth was far bigger than anything I'd prepared myself to face. I learned what happened to Ming that night through the servant's account the next morning, that Yi had come home unusually late, that his coat carried an Omega's scent strong enough for the servant to nearly mistake him for someone else. I sat and listened, nodded, and asked nothing more. Yi had been near the area where Ming rented his room on business, I knew that much, since I still kept track of his schedule. The faint bond between them had pulled him there just as Ming's heat hit unexpectedly. This time there was no darkness. This time they saw each other's faces. I didn't know what they'd said, what they'd done afterward, only that when he returned to the villa near dawn, he went straight to his own room without stopping by mine as he usually did. I lay in the dark, listening to his door close, counting each second passing over the rain-slicked roof. The bond between them that night was no longer faint as before. I could sense it, in some strange way I couldn't explain, like someone who feels a change in weather before the clouds even gather. The next morning Yi sat for breakfast as usual, poured tea as usual, asked if I'd slept well. I said I had, he nodded. We sat across from each other in our familiar silence, but today that silence weighed heavier, not the tense kind, but the kind between two people each holding too much unsaid at once. I knew the bond between Yi and Ming had locked deeper the night before. I knew Yi knew that I knew. And I knew he was standing before a choice with no answer that wasn't painful. On one side, the engagement, reputation, obligation to two families. On the other, a real bond he'd never had with me despite 2 years standing side by side. He finished his tea, set the cup down, and looked at me. Kai, I looked back at him. Tonight I want to talk. We sat in Yi's study after dinner, no servants, no chandeliers, just an oil lamp on the desk and the distant sound of Shanghai's streets drifting in. He asked me directly about that night. No circling, no leading up to it, straight to the point, the way he always did once he'd gathered enough pieces and needed no more. I looked at the oil lamp for a moment, then I said, yes, I arranged all of it, no denial, no immediate explanation. Just an admission, brief and cold, the way I'd practiced saying difficult things for years, said quickly, before my voice could betray a tremor. He looked at me, said nothing for a long while, then he asked why. I told him about the illness, what the doctor had said, about the bond and my body, about what I'd hidden since before the engagement was even arranged. My voice stayed calm throughout, only my hands, resting on my lap beneath the table, had clenched without my noticing. He sat and listened to everything I said without once interrupting. When I stopped, he was silent for a long time, looking at the oil lamp, looking at his own hands, then looking at me. He didn't ask more about my illness, didn't ask if it hurt, if I was afraid, if I needed anything. He only asked, did you think about Ming before bringing him into that night? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it. Because the true answer was no. I had thought of myself, of the bond, of the illness, of the engagement and the family and everything else. But I hadn't thought of Ming as a person with feelings, someone who could be hurt, someone who could be changed by that night. I had only thought of Ming as a solution. He saw my silence and understood the answer without needing me to say it. He stood, walked to the window, looked down at Shanghai's late-night streets glittering with lights, and said, in a voice calmer than mine had ever been, I'm calling off the engagement. He didn't turn to look at me when he said it. He stayed at the window, looking down at the street, his voice as calm as someone announcing a business decision. I'm calling off the engagement. I sat still. Not out of fear, but because I was watching him, reading every word in that voice and realizing something I'd known for a long time but never wanted to face head-on. He wasn't angry because he'd been betrayed. He was angry because of Ming. Because someone he didn't know had been pushed into a dark night without enough information to truly choose. And to Yi, that weighed heavier than any betrayal aimed at himself. I looked at his back and understood that this was the first time in 2 years I was truly seeing Yi. Not the fiancé on paper, not the young master of the Leng family, but the real man standing in this room. And that man was choosing Ming. I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because it was the only thing I could do in that moment without letting my voice break. I told Yi that if he called off the engagement, I would make everything public that night. Ming, the bond, all of it. That the Leng family would be the talk of all Shanghai within a month. That the trading house his father had spent decades building would lose something money could never buy back. My voice was cold and even, each word precise. He turned to look at me. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't calm, not anger, not contempt, but the look of someone who just realized they'd lived beside a person for 2 years without truly knowing who that person was. I kept the smile on my face until he walked out of the room. Then I looked down at my hands, trembling very slightly, almost imperceptibly. I had won this round. But I didn't know why. All I felt was exhaustion. I went to find Ming the following afternoon, not because I wanted to, but because if I didn't, you would find him first, and I needed Ming to leave before you could say anything at all. Ming opened the door, saw me, and I could tell at once that he already knew. I didn't need to say the first word. His face told me everything. I spoke anyway. Directly, briefly, no circling. That I had arranged that night, that Ming had been brought in to take my place, that the alpha in that dark room was my fiancé. Ming stood and listened, didn't interrupt. His face, a face I still wasn't used to looking straight at, went pale bit by bit as I spoke. Like someone hearing the translation of a night they thought they'd understood, but it turned out, hadn't understood at all. When I finished, I stood up. Ming said nothing to keep me there. I walked out, closed the door, and stood alone in the dark hallway, leaning against the wall, eyes closed. I had done what needed to be done. I told myself that the whole way home. 3 days later, Ming didn't come to the trading house. He said nothing to me. But I noticed him looking at the empty chair in the corner of his office longer than usual before starting each day. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, he went out alone without saying where. I knew he was going to find Ming. I sat in my room watching the oil lamp and did nothing to stop him. He came back near evening, empty-handed, carrying nothing, but something in his face had shifted, lighter somehow, like someone who just set down a burden carried too long. He walked past my room, stopped at the door. Ming will be back at work tomorrow. That was all. Then he kept walking. I watched his figure disappear down the hallway, thinking of Ming sitting alone in that small rented room, looking at the box of food he had brought, probably trying not to cry. I knew what that felt like, even though I'd never once let myself have it. The blood test results sat on Yi's desk one morning. I didn't know when he'd raid them, only that he didn't come down for lunch that day, and the servant said his study door had stayed shut since morning. I stood before that door for a moment, didn't knock. Went to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat alone at the empty dining table. I didn't need to read the report to know the result. I'd known the answer for a long time. Since that morning, I saw Ming at the market corner in the rain and realized that face was like looking into a mirror. I had simply never let myself form it into a complete sentence. Now Yi sat in that room, gripping a paper that read 99.97%, beginning to understand what I had buried before it ever had a name. I drank my tea. It had gone cold, and I hadn't noticed when. Yi laid the investigation file on the table in front of me that evening, said nothing, just slid it toward me and sat watching. I looked down. My mother's name on the first page. A woman I'd never met, never known the name of, only knew that she had given birth to me and died before I was old enough to remember anything. I turned to the next page, twins. Those 2 words sat in a small note. The ink faded with time, but clear enough that I had to read it twice to be sure I hadn't misread it. My father's principal wife was infertile. She agreed to take in 1 child into the family, only 1. The one taken in was me. The other was left at an orphanage on the outskirts on a winter morning that year by the very man I had called father for over 20 years. That other child was Ming. I set the file down, straightened it, and looked up at Yi. He looked back at me, said nothing, waited. I said, "Give me 1 night." My voice was so calm that even I didn't quite recognize it as my own. The next morning, I stood at the door of Yi's office, looking inside. Ming sat at a small desk in the corner, bent over a file, his lips moving along with the numbers as if double-checking himself. Every so often he frowned, tapped the end of his pen against the desk, then nodded once as if he'd just convinced himself of something. He stood by the window watching Ming, not the files, not the street outside. Just Ming, in a way I recognized at once, because it was a look he had never once given me in 2 years living together. Ming glanced up, caught Yi watching, gave a small nod, then turned back to the file. Yi stayed where he was. I quietly slipped away before anyone noticed me standing there, down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the courtyard, and stood beneath the Shanghai morning sky until I could breathe normally again. I went to find Ming alone that afternoon, not to send him away this time, not out of any plan or calculation, only because I needed to look straight at his face once, to know clearly who I was looking at. Ming opened the door, saw me, and didn't close it, just stood there, looking at me with the eyes of someone braced for a confrontation but unsure which way it would go. I looked at that face. This time I didn't hold back, didn't glance and look away. I looked, truly, for a long time, from the line of his brow to the corner of his mouth to the way he tilted his left shoulder slightly when uncertain. I tilted my left shoulder the same way when uncertain. Neither of us spoke first for a stretch of time so long I lost count of it. Then Ming asked quietly, "What did you come to say?" I opened my mouth and realized I didn't know. He told Ming the truth about the test results that evening. I knew because afterward he came home and sat across from me, didn't eat dinner, just looked at me for a while before telling me. He said Ming sat in silence for a long time after hearing it. The room was quiet enough to hear the oil lamp crackling. Then Ming laughed, not a happy laugh, not one through tears, but the kind of laugh from someone who had just heard a story too large for anything they'd braced themselves to receive. And Ming said, "So you bonded with your fiancé's own brother. How funny." He stopped there, looking down at his hands. I didn't ask what he said to Ming after that. I didn't want to know because whatever he said, no words could have been enough to fill the space that line of Ming's had carved out across that dinner table. Ming came to find me the next morning, knocked, stood at the doorway, looked at me with eyes entirely different from before. Not the eyes of someone being sent away, not the eyes of someone who didn't understand what was happening. This time he understood everything, and that gaze was heavier, more real in a way I wasn't fully prepared to face. He asked outright, "Did you know before you came looking for me?" I shook my head. That answer was true. I hadn't known about the blood relation before I saw the test results. But Ming looked into my eyes, looked for a long time, then gave a small nod, the nod of someone confirming what they'd already suspected, not what they'd just been told. He saw the thin line between not knowing and not wanting to know in my eyes. I stood before my own brother in a room flooded with morning light, with nothing more to say. I knocked on Yi's study door that night, not for business, not to discuss anything about the trading house, only because there was one question I needed to ask, and if I didn't ask it tonight, I didn't know when I'd ever have the courage again. He sat behind his desk, looking up as I walked in. I closed the door, sat in the chair across from him, and looked straight at his face. Not the calculating look I always wore, but a real one, the first time in 2 years I'd let myself look at him that way. I asked, "Do you really love him?" He didn't hesitate, didn't look away. "Yes," one word. I sat still for a second, then laughed, light, brief, the kind of laugh from someone who just heard an answer they already knew but still needed spoken aloud to truly believe. He watched me laugh without saying anything. I stood, straightened my robe, and walked out of the room. There are questions that once asked, leave nothing more to say. The answer is already enough, even if it's an enough no one fully wants. The dinner Yi arranged took place one weekend evening. He said he wanted the three of us to sit down and talk honestly. Used that exact word, honestly, as if any single word could be enough to describe what we were about to face together. Ming arrived on time, sat down, hands resting on his lap. I arrived after, sat across from him. Yi sat at the head of the table, pouring tea for all three of us. No one drank right away. The servants brought the food up, set it out, then withdrew and closed the door. The dining room fell suddenly silent in a way that made the sounds of Shanghai's streets outside the window seem clearer than ever. Cars, voices, the lives of people who didn't have to sit in this room. Yi opened his mouth to speak. Ming looked down at his bowl. I looked at the candle on the table. Then no one said anything at all, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much to say, too much to know where to begin, and wherever we began, it would never be enough to hold everything else. We ate dinner in silence. None of us ate much. My father walked into Yi's study with the bearing of a man who saw no reason to be afraid, back straight, cane in hand, glancing around the room like a guest paying a visit rather than someone summoned. I stood in the corner, didn't sit. He looked at me, gave his usual nod, then sat in the chair across from Yi. Yi didn't greet him, didn't ease into it, laid the file and the test results flat on the desk and pushed them across. My father looked down. He denied it at once, his voice firm, unshaking, said the test results could be wrong, that the Western clinic wasn't reliable, that this was a family matter that didn't need outsiders involved. Yi sat still, didn't interrupt, let him finish. Then he simply looked into my father's eyes, said nothing, just looked, with the gaze of someone who already knew everything and was waiting to see whether the other man would keep performing. My father's expression changed, not the face of a guilty man, the face of someone caught. My father spoke for 15 minutes. I stood in the corner and didn't hear a single word. Not because I didn't want to, but because from the moment he opened his mouth, my mind had already gone back to a morning when I was 7, asking him why our family had no siblings like other families did. He'd said, "You're enough." I had believed that sentence for over a decade, sitting there listening to him explain to Yi about the twins, the orphanage, the person hired to watch from a distance. I suddenly understood that "you're enough" had never meant I was enough for him. It meant one child was enough, the other wasn't needed. I looked down at my own hands, at the fingers I'd always thought resembled my mother's, and for the first time wondered whether Ming's hands looked the same. Then I heard him reach the part about hiring someone to watch Ming from a distance. Year after year, making sure the child stayed alive, stayed healthy, never went hungry to the point of danger, watched but never approached, seen but never claimed. My father called that care. Standing in the corner, I stopped being able to hear past that point, not from anger, not from pain, but because something in my chest had just cracked quietly in a way I hadn't prepared for. I don't remember when I walked out of that room. I only remember the hallway, long, dark, the sound of my own shoes on the wooden floor echoing one beat at a time. He called my name from behind. I didn't stop. Walked outside, through the front doors, down the steps, out into the courtyard, and stood there in the middle of the Shanghai night, looking up at a sky with no stars, hidden behind thick clouds. I didn't cry. I never cried. That was something I'd given up long ago, given up along with so many other things a person has to give up to survive in a family they know they don't fully belong to. But my shoulders trembled. Lightly, almost imperceptibly, but in that cold night, I felt it more clearly than anything else. He took Ming to meet my father one morning. I wasn't there, wasn't told beforehand, only learned of it once they'd both returned. He told me about it that night, sitting by the window, his voice calm but his eyes fixed on the street outside the whole time he spoke. He said my father looked Ming over from head to toe, a long, careful look, the way someone checks whether memory matches reality. Then he said, "You don't belong here." Yi said Ming stood and listened to that, didn't react right away, just looked back at my father for a moment, then lowered his head, then his shoulders began to shake, not crying aloud. Just trembling, tears falling without him raising a hand to wipe them, like someone so unused to crying in front of others that he didn't know what to do once it happened. He stood beside Ming the whole time, said nothing, didn't put a hand on his shoulder, just stood there. I listened to that and looked down at the cup of tea in my hands, gone cold, and I hadn't noticed. The doctor called me into the clinic one afternoon near the end of the month. Not a routine check this time. but because the latest results showed something he said needed to be addressed directly without delay. I sat across from him, hands folded neatly on my lap, and listened. The faint bond between Yi and me, never fully locked, but never severed either, was now affecting my body in a way the suppressants could no longer mask. He said if the bond remained suspended like this, my body would continue to deteriorate. If it were fully locked, impossible, since that would only accelerate the decline. If severed suddenly, given my current condition, the odds of surviving were very low. I sat and listened to the three options, then asked him, "Is there any other way?" He was silent for a moment, then shook his head. I thanked him, stood, and walked out under Shanghai's golden afternoon light, thinking the weather was truly beautiful today. He came to find me that night, sat down across from me, no preamble, said plainly that he already knew my test results, that the doctor had reached out to him under urgent request. I asked what he meant to say. He said he had told Ming the truth about this situation, about the bond, about how if it were severed right now I might not survive, that Ming would have to wait if Ming chose to wait. I looked at him for a moment, then asked, "Tell me honestly, did you tell Ming because you wanted to be fair to him, or because you wanted him to give you more time?" He didn't answer right away, sat looking at me, then said, "Both." I nodded. That was the most honest answer he could have given me at that moment, and I was grateful to him for it, grateful in a way I had no words to properly express. I asked you what Ming had said after hearing it. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then told me that Ming sat in silence through all of it, then looked up, then said, "Don't worry about me, I'm used to being on my own." Calm. No blame, no demands, no single word weighted any heavier than the rest. He stopped there, said nothing more. I looked at his face and understood that Ming's calm words were hurting him in a way reproach never could have. Because reproach, people knew how to answer, but the calm of someone long used to expecting nothing from anyone left no answer worthy of filling that space. I knew that feeling. I was the one who had placed Ming into the circumstances that taught him to be calm like that. Though not me alone, though before me there had been our father, the orphanage, 20-some years where no one ever looked back, I knew, and I said nothing. Just sat there in shared silence with Yi, carrying that line with me like one more thing with no place to set down. I knocked on Ming's door at midnight, unannounced, with no reason solid enough to explain why it had to be now rather than tomorrow morning or some other day, only that I needed to go, and tonight was the night I still had the courage to. Ming opened the door, saw me, said nothing, just stepped aside to let me in. I sat down in the room's only wooden chair, looked around the small space, yellowed walls, a flickering oil lamp, a neat stack of old books in the corner of the desk. Then I looked at Ming and for the first time called him. Ming stood still, looking at me. I said, "I'm sorry about that night, not about the blood relation, not about our father, those weren't things either of us chose. But that night was something I arranged and I used you as a tool." That was wrong. No further explanation. No justification, just that. Ming looked at me for a long time, long enough that I began to think he wouldn't say anything at all, that he'd simply look until I stood and left on my own. Then he nodded, lightly, slowly, but real. I stayed a while longer, said nothing more, and realized this was the first time in many years I'd sat in a room without needing to control a single thing. Ming didn't send me away after I apologized. He boiled water, made tea, set 2 cups on the table, didn't ask if I wanted any, just set them down, then sat on the floor, leaning against the bed frame, looking up at the ceiling. I sat down beside him. Neither of us spoke first, just sat, listening to late-night Shanghai drift in through the window, the sound of cars growing sparser by the hour. Then Ming asked if I was afraid of thunder. The question was so small I didn't know whether to laugh. Then I said yes, afraid since childhood, never knew why, just that whenever thunder struck, I'd sit perfectly still, too afraid to move. Ming said he couldn't swim. I said I hated the smell of hospitals because I was sickly as a child, and every time I fell ill our father would take me to the Western clinic and sit waiting in the hallway, never coming inside. Ming said he liked rain because the orphanage had a tin roof, and when it rained the sound on the roof was loud and clear, and it helped him sleep. We sat there until nearly dawn, telling small, aimless things, not because those things mattered, but because it was the only way we knew to begin understanding each other without touching the things still too large to touch. For the first time, I learned how Ming had grown up. For the first time, I had a brother. I ran into Yi the next morning when I returned to the villa. He sat in the dining room, a cup of coffee in hand, watching me walk in with the look of someone who'd stayed up since midnight without saying so. I sat across from him, poured myself a cup, and said plainly, "I'll handle the bond myself." "You don't need to stay for my sake." Yi set down his cup, looked at me. "What are you planning to do?" I took a sip, looked out the window, watched Shanghai's morning street waking under the early sun, street vendors with their carrying poles, rickshaws, the calls of hawkers drifting from the end of the road. Then I looked back at Yi and smiled. Not the concealing smile from before, but the smile of someone who had already decided something and felt lighter for it, lighter in a way an outsider looking in wouldn't understand. I didn't answer his question, just finished my coffee, set the cup down, and stood. I went back to the Western clinic that afternoon, alone, as always. This time, not a routine exam. I sat across from the elderly French doctor and asked directly about the forced one-way bond-severing procedure, a method I knew existed, though rare, though without enough successful cases to be called safe. He looked at me longer than usual before speaking. Then he said, "The mortality risk given my current condition was very high, so high he could barely look me in the eye to say the number aloud. I asked if he would perform it. He said that wasn't a question for him to answer." I placed the consent form on the desk, already filled out, only the signature left blank. He looked at the paper, looked at me, then stood and stepped out for a while. I thought he wouldn't come back, that he'd return to tell me he couldn't do this. But he came back, sat down, and set a pen on the desk. I signed. My handwriting was steady, unshaking. I packed my things the next morning, not much, only what was truly mine in this villa, things that, if left behind, no one would know what to do with. The book he had given me our first year of engagement, I set it on his desk, squared neatly, spine facing out, no letter, no explanation enclosed. I thought he'd understand. He always understood the things left unsaid, something I'd both resented and been grateful for in him these past 2 years. I didn't think he'd understand this quickly. That afternoon, a servant knocked on my door, said someone from the Lang household had come asking after me, their voice urgent. I looked at the door for a moment, then put on my coat, picked up my bag, and left through the back entrance. I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway outside, and I knew without looking that it was Yi. I turned my head. Through the glass of the door, I saw him standing there alone, his coat not fully buttoned, his hair uncombed, like someone who'd run the whole way from the end of the street without sparing a thought for any of that. He looked in, looked at me. I looked back at him. He pressed his hand against the glass, a hand I'd known for 2 years, always calm, always steady, now pressed against the cold pane, unable to say anything. I looked at that hand for a second. Then turned my face back up toward the white ceiling, made no sign to stop him, not because I didn't see him, not because I didn't want to, but because if I looked a second longer, I wouldn't have had the courage left to keep lying there. I closed my eyes, breathed evenly. Ming arrived after. I didn't see it, only learned of it through what happened later. He sent someone to find him, and Ming ran to the hospital that evening, his thin cotton clothes not yet changed, standing outside the glass beside Yi. The two of them said nothing to each other. Just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, looking into the room where I lay, looking at the twin brother who had never been allowed to live his own life, now choosing something that could kill him, to set them free, perhaps to set even himself free. I no longer looked outward. But I knew they were standing there, knew it the way the faint bond about to break could still carry one last thing across before everything went dark. I woke up. That was the first thing I registered, that I had woken up at all, that the white ceiling was still there above me, that morning light was slipping through the window in pale gold, the same as every other morning. My right hand had no feeling. I tried moving my fingers slowly, like someone relearning from the start, and only 3 fingers responded. The doctor said it was nerve damage, that it might improve over time or might not. I nodded. Then I looked over. Yi and Ming stood together in the corner of the room, both watching me with the eyes of people who'd just been through a sleepless night and didn't know what to say first. I watched them standing there like that, Ming's shoulder close to Yi's, naturally without any effort, and I smiled. For the first time in many years, that smile had nothing hidden behind it. In the days I spent recovering, the three of us slowly found a way to exist in the same space without anyone needing to pretend anything. There was no name for what we had, not a love triangle, not a family in any conventional sense, just three people carrying each other's wounds, sitting together, asking nothing of one another but to be exactly what they were. Ming often came in the afternoons, sitting by my bed, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting quietly. He often came in the evenings, sitting in the chair by the corner, working through trading house files, occasionally glancing up at me before looking back down without a word. Some afternoons, all three of us were in the room together, Ming on the floor, Yi in the chair, me lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and no one spoke, just sat there, listening to the sounds of Shanghai drifting in from far away. I think those were the most ordinary afternoons I ever had. He told me first, not asking for my opinion, just telling me, the way he always did with decisions already made but that he still wanted me to know about. He said he and Ming would bond fully, completely, on an afternoon when both of them were clear-headed enough to understand what they were choosing. I sat and listened, looking out the window. Shanghai in the afternoon, golden and tired, the last light of day stretching long across the rooftops, across streets I had walked for over 20 years and was now about to leave. He asked if I wanted to say anything. I shook my head. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what I wanted to say didn't belong to this afternoon, didn't belong to this room, didn't belong to any place I still had a part in. When he walked out, I turned back to the window and sat there until the sky went fully dark. I left Shanghai early one morning while the streets had not yet fully woken. My luggage was light, one small suitcase, only the things that were truly mine, enough to start again somewhere else. On the kitchen table I left a small folded note, no name on it. Ming would know who it was for. I wrote it with my left hand, since my right still couldn't hold a pen steadily, the handwriting a little shaky but legible. Live, well, for the part of life I missed out on. I walked outside, climbed into the carriage I'd already hired, and didn't look back. But I knew, as the carriage rolled through the familiar streets, as Shanghai slowly shrank behind me, that back in that villa, Yi and Ming were standing at the window, looking out. The bond between them was warm, real, the one thing in this entire story no one would have to pay any further price for. As for me, I sat in the carriage, looking out the window, taking in Shanghai's morning one last time, the street vendors with their carrying poles, the dew-slicked rooftops, the calls of hawkers from the end of the street, and thought that this truly was a beautiful city. One I'd simply never had the time to notice while I was busy controlling everything within it. The carriage moved further away. Shanghai faded behind a curtain of morning mist. I closed my eyes, leaned my head against the side of the carriage, and for the first time in many years, didn't think about what came next. Shanghai remained the same after that night, still bustling, still cold, still indifferent to the small stories unfolding behind the closed doors of every villa in the concession. Only 3 people knew that in that villa, someone had chosen to lose so another could win, and called it the only choice he had left. Some will say Kai was the villain, someone who used his own brother as a tool, cold and calculating to the point of cruelty. Some will say Kai was the most pitiable of the 3, someone who knew he would lose before the game even began, yet still fought to control every move until the very last. And you, after everything Kai did and everything he endured, who do you see him as?